On a cold January morning in 1931, the kind of morning when Georgia fog lies thick and heavy over the land like a shroud, a groundskeeper named James Stark began his usual rounds across a sprawling estate north of Atlanta. The grass of the putting green glistened with moisture, and the world felt strangely muted, as if sound itself had been swallowed by the mist. Stark had walked these grounds countless times before. He knew every path, every rise and dip in the land, every place where something belonged, and where it did not. That was why the sight of a parked automobile near the edge of the green immediately unsettled him. Cars did not stop there. At first he tried to reason it away. Perhaps it belonged to someone from nearby Emory College, whose faculty were occasionally allowed to walk the property. But as Stark drew closer, an unshakable dread crept into his chest, a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter air. Inside the car sat two motionless figures, a young man behind the wheel and a young woman slumped beside him. Blood had dried dark against their clothing. Both had been killed by gunshot wounds. The man's hand still rested near an ivory-handled pistol, elegant and unmistakably expensive, a weapon that did not belong to him. It belonged to the owner of the estate itself. Within hours, whispers would ripple across Atlanta, and by nightfall headlines would scream the name of the eccentric millionaire whose world had collided with sudden, irreversible violence. The mansion looming behind the fog, vast, ornate, and unreal, would never again be seen as merely a place of wonder. From that moment on, it would be haunted not only by rumor and legend, but by the undeniable fact that death had arrived quietly, parked on its manicured lawn. Yet this tragedy was not the beginning of the story. It was the end of an illusion. To understand how murder came to stain this fairy tale estate, one must travel backward, far beyond the marble halls and gold leaf ceilings, back to dusty Georgia roads, and a time when the name tied to this land meant nothing at all. Before the elephants, before the music that thundered through gilded rooms, before magic tricks and champagne and scandal, there was only a boy, a pharmacist's dream, and a peculiar brown syrup that would change America forever. Long before tragedy found the manicured lawns of Briarcliff, before wealth curdled into excess and spectacle, the story began in far humbler surroundings, with a man whose ambitions were practical, disciplined, and deeply rooted in faith. Asa Candler was born in 1851 in the small town of Villarica, Georgia, the son of a prosperous merchant and planter. His upbringing was shaped by two powerful forces, relentless work and Methodist devotion. In a post-Civil War South, struggling to redefine itself, young Asa did not dream of grandeur or indulgence. He dreamed of stability, respectability, and service. Trained as a pharmacist, he moved to the growing city of Atlanta in 1873, where he opened a modest drugstore and spent years selling patent medicines to a population eager for cures, comforts, and modern remedies. For more than a decade, his life followed a steady, unremarkable path, until 1888, when fate arrived disguised as desperation. A fellow pharmacist, John Stith Pemberton, sick, financially ruined, and running out of time, approached Candler with a formula for a sweet, fizzy tonic known as Coca-Cola. What most men saw as a curious but unremarkable concoction, Asa Candler saw as possibility itself. For a sum rumored to be no more than $2,300, he acquired full control of the formula, and with it unknowingly purchased the foundation of a global empire. Candler did not invent Coca-Cola, but he transformed it. He marketed the drink with evangelical intensity, giving away free samples, saturating newspapers with advertisements, and branding everyday objects with its name until the drink became impossible to ignore. By 1895, Coca-Cola was sold in every state and territory in the United States, and Candler's fortune grew at a pace that mirrored the nation's appetite for progress. His wealth spilled into banking, real estate, and civic power. He reshaped downtown Atlanta with towering buildings, helped develop elite neighborhoods like Druid Hills, and poured millions into philanthropy, most notably helping establish Emory University as a major institution after its relocation to Atlanta. In 1916, his influence culminated in his election as mayor of Atlanta, where he led the city through crisis and reconstruction after the Great Fire of 1917. By the time Asa Candler Sr. stood at the height of his power, he embodied everything the American dream promised: discipline rewarded, faith affirmed, order imposed on chaos. Yet even as he built an empire defined by control and calculation, the seeds of a very different legacy were growing inside his own household, one that would inherit his wealth, but not his restraint, and would transform the magic of a bottled drink into something far more dangerous when poured into the restless hands of his son. If Asa Candler Sr. represented discipline, patience, and controlled ambition, his second son seemed almost designed to challenge every one of those virtues. Asa Candler Jr., born in 1880, arrived into a world already tilting toward wealth and influence. Yet from the earliest years, it was clear that money alone would never be enough to steady him. The family called him Buddy, a nickname that followed him into adulthood and hinted at the boyish energy he never quite outgrew. Where his older brother, Charles Howard, was careful, studious, and reliable, Buddy was impulsive, excitable, and perpetually in motion. He struggled in school, found church unbearable, and seemed unable to focus on anything that did not immediately ignite his interest. Modern historians and psychologists have speculated that he may have suffered from what would now be called attention deficit disorder, but in the late 19th century there were no diagnoses, only disappointment and confusion. His parents, alarmed and unsure how to shape their unruly son, sent him away at the age of 8 to live with relatives in Cartersville, Georgia, enrolling him in his Aunt Florence's school, an institution intended for girls, a decision that spoke volumes about their desperation to find any place that might tame him. It did not. Buddy grew into a young man who was charming, imaginative, and wildly inconsistent, capable of astonishing bursts of enthusiasm followed by total abandonment of responsibility. When he enrolled at Emory College, following the path expected of a Candler son, he showed little academic distinction. His classmates included future leaders and statesmen, but Buddy's mind was elsewhere, drawn not to books or sermons but to the roaring promise of the modern world. Automobiles fascinated him. They were loud, dangerous, fast, and uncontrollable, everything Buddy himself felt inside. After graduation, his father sent him west to help establish Coca-Cola bottling operations, hoping that distance and responsibility might refine him. Instead, Buddy treated each new assignment like a temporary obsession, working feverishly until boredom set in and his attention drifted toward the next idea. In 1905, he married Helen McHill, a cultured and admired young woman who seemed, at least on the surface, to represent stability. Atlanta society approved of the match, and for a brief moment it appeared that Buddy might finally settle into the role his family expected. A tragedy struck when their infant son died, and something inside Buddy fractured. Grief did not slow him, it accelerated him. He began chasing projects with manic intensity, as if motion itself could keep sorrow from catching him. That restless energy would soon find a grand and dangerous outlet, one that allowed Buddy to indulge his obsessions without restraint, and set him on a collision course with excess, spectacle, and ultimately ruin. By the second decade of the 20th century, Buddy Candler's restless ambition had found its stage, and it rose not in a boardroom or factory, but on 42 rolling acres of land just north of Atlanta. In 1910, while much of his attention was still consumed by automobile racing and grand but unprofitable ventures, Buddy purchased a weathered farmhouse along Williams Mill Road, not far from his older brother's refined estate. The property was known as Briarcliff Farm, and at first Buddy treated it as a practical experiment, throwing himself into agriculture with the same feverish enthusiasm that defined every phase of his life. He raised cows, sheep, pigs, and chickens, transforming the land into a model farm that impressed agricultural experts with its cleanliness and innovation. Electric lights illuminated the barns, fans cooled the animals in Georgia's oppressive summers, and even the cows drank from individual fountains, a detail that delighted visitors and reinforced Buddy's reputation as a man who spared no expense when imagination struck. During the First World War, Briarcliff supplied milk to military installations, earning praise and legitimacy, yet farming, like racing before it, soon proved insufficient. Buddy watched his father's fortune multiply and his siblings erect elegant homes across Druid Hills, and something darker and more competitive took root inside him. He did not want to match them. He wanted to eclipse them. In 1916, when Asa Candler Sr. transferred his wealth to his children and relinquished control of Coca-Cola, Buddy suddenly possessed resources beyond anything he had ever known. And in 1919, When the family sold the Coca-Cola company outright, Buddy's restraint vanished entirely. With money pouring in and no authority left to temper him, he looked at the modest farmhouse at Briarcliff and saw not land, but a blank canvas. Construction began in 1920, and what rose from the red Georgia soil was not a home, but a declaration. Buddy hired architect C.E. Fraser, assisted by Dan Bowden, to design a mansion that would surpass anything his family had built before. The style was Georgian revival, respectable on paper, but the scale was outrageous. When completed in 1922, Briarcliff contained more than 40 rooms, 7 bedrooms, 10 bathrooms, multiple solariums, a grand library wrapped in hand-carved wood paneling, and a third-floor ballroom with 14-foot ceilings washed in gold leaf. Buddy demanded marble fireplaces in every bedroom, intricate moldings, coffered ceilings, terrace gardens, greenhouses overflowing with exotic plants, and not one but 2 swimming pools, one reserved for family, the other open to the public, complete with a Coca-Cola stand that blurred the line between private fantasy and public spectacle. Newspapers marveled at the expense, reporting tens of thousands of dollars spent on tile work alone, and yet even this was not enough. Briarcliff was meant to astonish, to overwhelm, to leave no doubt that Asa Candler Jr. mattered. What Buddy was building was not merely a mansion, but a personal mythology, a fairy tale kingdom where his failures could be drowned in grandeur and his insecurities buried beneath marble, music, and light. In stone and gold leaf he was trying to prove, to his family, to Atlanta, and perhaps most of all to himself, that restlessness could be mistaken for greatness if it was wrapped in splendor. By the mid-1920s, Briarcliff had already surpassed anything Atlanta society had seen before. Yet for Buddy Candler, excess was never a destination. It was a stepping stone. Luxury alone no longer satisfied him. He wanted awe. He wanted wonder. And above all, he wanted to feel in control of a world that had always slipped through his fingers. In 1925, just 3 years after the mansion's completion, Buddy ordered an addition that would become the emotional and symbolic heart of the estate, a monumental music hall rising 3 stories high, wrapped in richly carved oak panels and crowned by a vaulted Tudor ceiling. At one end stood a towering limestone fireplace, 9 feet tall, its presence less domestic than ceremonial. But the true centerpiece of the room was something few private citizens in America could claim. Buddy installed a colossal pipe organ costing nearly $94,000, an astronomical sum for the time. With 88 ranks and 187 stops, it was the largest privately owned organ in Georgia, rivaling those found in cathedrals. His father owned an organ. His brother owned one too. Buddy's had to be bigger. The room known as Dove's Hall became a stage not just for music, but for ego, ambition, and performance. Concerts were held there and broadcast on into both a private fantasy and a public spectacle. Yet music was only the beginning. Buddy had always been drawn to illusion, to the idea that reality could be bent, reshaped, or momentarily suspended. As the decade wore on, that fascination deepened into obsession. He began collecting magical apparatus on a scale that stunned even professional illusionists. Disappearing cabinets and trapdoors, mirror boxes, secret panels, elaborate stage props filling the third-floor ballroom until it resembled a magician's warehouse. It was during this period that Buddy's path crossed with Jose Cruz, a young, gifted illusionist he met during travels abroad. Charismatic, talented, and eager for opportunity, Cruz represented everything Buddy admired: skill without limits, mystery without explanation. Buddy invited him to Atlanta, offering him a home at Briarcliff and a role as both personal magic tutor and butler. Cruz accepted, arriving in the United States with his brother and settling into an apartment above the estate's garage. Soon the mansion became a temple of illusion. The ballroom was transformed into a theater, complete with a secret door likely used for dramatic disappearances. Buddy flew famous magicians in on his private plane, including Harry Blackstone, one of the era's most celebrated performers. Buddy even claimed friendship with Harry Houdini, a claim impossible to fully verify, yet plausible enough to feed the legend, given their overlapping social and business circles. Atlanta's elite flocked to these gatherings, sipping champagne beneath gold leaf walls as impossible things unfolded before their eyes. For a brief, glittering moment, Briarcliff became a place where logic bowed to spectacle. where a wealthy man's desires could summon music, mystery, and amazement on demand. But illusion has a cost. Magic depends on secrecy, misdirection, and control, and Buddy's life was built on none of those things. Even as he tried to master deception on stage, his personal world was quietly unraveling. Beneath the organ's thunder and the applause of dazzled guests, darker forces were already gathering, waiting for the moment when illusion would fail and reality would return with a violence no trick could erase. In the months leading up to that cold January morning in 1931, the world inside Briarcliff was no longer held together by music and illusion alone. Beneath the glittering surface, tensions had begun to surface, quiet and unresolved, like cracks forming beneath polished marble. Jose Cruz, the talented magician who had become such a central figure in Buddy Candler's life, had developed a relationship that existed far beyond the walls of the mansion. He had been seeing a young local woman named Gladys Fricks, and while those close to her later said she seemed genuinely happy, her family was deeply uneasy. Some disapproved of Cruz's background, others of his intense and secretive nature, but whatever their reasons, they viewed the relationship as dangerous. Gladys, however, continued to see him, drawn perhaps to his charm, his mystery, and the promise of escape from an ordinary life. On the night of January 17, 1931, the two went out together willingly, enjoying an evening that appeared unremarkable to anyone watching from the outside. At some point during the night, Cruz drove them onto the southern edge of the Briarcliff Estate, near the putting green where Buddy often practiced golf, a quiet place far removed from the mansion's lights and servants. What transpired there remains cloaked in uncertainty, but what is known is devastating. When dawn came and James Stark discovered the car, Cruz was slumped in the driver's seat, dead from a gunshot wound to the temple. Gladys lay lifeless beside him, killed by a bullet to the abdomen. A note was found suggesting a tragic double suicide, a love story crushed by opposition and despair. Yet almost immediately the narrative began to unravel. Investigators noticed that the handwriting in the note, supposedly written by Gladys, matched Cruz's. Only one spent cartridge was found, despite 2 gunshot victims. And most damning of all, the ivory-handled pistol found in the car belonged not to Cruz, but to Asa Candler Jr. himself. A coroner's jury was convened within hours, and after examining the evidence, they rejected the romance of the suicide pact. Their conclusion was stark and final. Jose Cruz had murdered Gladys Fricks and then turned the gun on himself. The weapon was publicly displayed by the undertaker, photographed alongside a pearl-handled dagger also found in the car, and the images spread quickly through Atlanta's newspapers. Though Buddy Candler was never implicated and no evidence suggested he knew Cruz had taken his gun, the stain of the crime seeped into every corner of Briarcliff. The magic parties stopped. The ballroom fell silent. Guests who once begged for invitations now avoided the estate entirely. What had been a fairyland of music, animals, and illusion was suddenly defined by betrayal and bloodshed. For Buddy, the loss cut deeply. He had trusted Cruz, welcomed him into his home, elevated him into a world few could enter. Now that trust had ended in irreversible horror. The mansion that once promised escape from reality had become the site of its cruelest reminder. No amount of wealth, spectacle, or illusion could prevent human darkness from finding its way in. The years after the murders marked a slow, unmistakable turning of the tide, not just for Briarcliff, but for Buddy Candler himself. The 1930s arrived carrying the full weight of the Great Depression, and even fortunes as legendary as the Candlers could not remain untouched by the cold economic winds sweeping across America. The stock market collapse of 1929 had already rattled the foundations of old wealth, and the death of Buddy's father that same year removed the last stabilizing force in his life. Without Asa Candler S's presence, there was no longer anyone whose approval Buddy sought or feared, and paradoxically that freedom left him unmoored. His drinking, which had long been whispered about in social circles, became harder to disguise. Friends noticed the tremor in his hands, the glassiness in his eyes, the way his once boundless energy now swung between manic bursts and long, hollow silences. Florence, his second wife, struggled to hold both her husband and the vast estate together, but Briarcliff had become an insatiable machine, consuming money and effort at a pace that even Buddy's resources could no longer sustain. The zoo was gone, shut down after the baboon incident and the mounting pressure from neighbors. The magic equipment gathered dust in locked rooms. Dove's Hall, once alive with organ music and applause, echoed with emptiness. Strangely, as his world narrowed, Buddy's fascination with death deepened. For decades he had been involved in the management of Westview Cemetery, and now he devoted himself to it with obsessive focus, overseeing mausoleums, pathways, and monuments with the same intensity he had once lavished on gardens and ballrooms. He designed his own mausoleum in meticulous detail, refining it year after year, as if planning his final resting place gave him the sense of control he had lost everywhere else. By the late 1930s, something unexpected happened. Buddy stopped drinking. Against all expectations, the man many assumed would drink himself into an early grave, put down the bottle, and remain sober for the rest of his life. Yet sobriety could not undo the damage already done, nor could it save Briarcliff. The cost of maintaining 42 acres, a massive mansion, and dwindling staff became overwhelming. Rooms once filled with guests now stood dark, gardens grew wild, the pools still shimmered under the Georgia sun, but laughter had long since faded from their edges. During the 1940s, as America turned its attention to war overseas, Buddy watched his own empire quietly collapse. By 1948, the illusion could no longer be maintained. Asa Candler Jr., once the most flamboyant host in Atlanta, was forced to sell Briarcliff to the federal government, which planned to convert the estate into a veterans hospital. The sale price was a fraction of what the mansion had cost. A final humiliation for a man who had always equated worth with spectacle. The hospital was never built, and the estate sat empty, waiting, as Buddy and Florence moved into a penthouse at the Briarcliff Hotel, another reminder of past ambition. When Buddy died in 1953, he left behind not just a failed dream, but a structure saturated with decades of human emotion, joy, excess, grief, obsession, and violence. That same year, Briarcliff was reborn yet again, transformed into the Georgian Clinic, the first alcohol rehabilitation center in the state of Georgia, an irony so sharp it felt intentional. The mansion that had witnessed addiction now sought to cure it. Later, its fate grew darker still when it became part of the Georgia Mental Health Institute, its elegant rooms stripped and subdivided, its beauty buried beneath linoleum and institutional paint. For more than 30 years, thousands of patients passed through its halls, their suffering layering itself onto the walls like invisible residue. Underground tunnels connected buildings, designed for efficiency, but destined to fuel nightmares. And the house absorbed everything: treatment, neglect, fear, hope, without protest. By the time the hospital closed in 1997, Briarcliff was no longer merely a mansion. It was a vessel, heavy with memory, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to listen to what it had been forced to hold. If Buddy Candler believed that death would finally still the restless motion of his life, Briarcliff proved him wrong. The mansion outlived its creator, and in doing so, it took on a second life far stranger and more enduring than anything Buddy could have planned. After the Georgian Clinic closed and the Georgia Mental Health Institute eventually shut its doors in 1997, the estate was left behind like a forgotten relic, too costly to restore, too historic to destroy. When Emory University acquired the property in 1998, the acquisition felt almost poetic. The institution that Asa Candler Sr. had helped build decades earlier now held the crumbling monument created by his troubled son. Yet Emory had no clear purpose for it. The mansion was structurally wounded, its roof leaking, mold creeping through once grand rooms, and restoration costs climbing into the millions. So the university chose patience over action. Briarcliff was secured, monitored, and largely left alone, standing quietly as vines crept closer and silence replaced the echoes of history. During those years of neglect, stories began to grow. Trespassers slipped inside and reported strange noises, flickering lights, and a presence that felt heavier than imagination alone could explain. The underground tunnels, sealed and forbidden, became the centerpiece of whispered legends. Graffiti appeared, some crude, some chilling, including a phrase scrawled inside a former solarium fountain. It ran with blood. Whether vandalism or expression, it deepened the sense that the house remembered everything. Then, unexpectedly, the modern world rediscovered Briarcliff, but not for the reason preservationists hoped. In 2016, the abandoned hospital tower on the property was used as a filming location for the Netflix series Stranger Things, serving as the ominous Hawkins National Laboratory. Fans flocked to the site, cameras raised, drawn by fiction, never realizing that just beyond the trees stood a mansion with a far darker and richer real history. The spotlight passed over Briarcliff itself, leaving the heart of the story still hidden. Yet not everyone forgot. Preservation advocates like Charlie Payne and researchers like Sarah Butler refused to let the mansion dissolve into obscurity. Through archives, photographs, and relentless curiosity, they reconstructed the life of Buddy Candler, not as a caricature of excess, but as a complicated, driven, deeply flawed man whose ambitions reshaped Atlanta in ways both visible and invisible. Slowly, attention shifted. In 2022, hope finally arrived in concrete form when Emory brokered a long-term ground lease with Gallery Living, a developer willing to restore the mansion as part of a luxury senior living community. For the first time in nearly a century, craftsmen returned to Briarcliff not to strip it down, but to rebuild it. Roofs were repaired, walls stabilized, carved wood uncovered, marble fireplaces cleaned, and the bones of Buddy's impossible dream revealed once more. The organ was gone, the elephants long since dust, but the soul of the house endured. Today, Briarcliff stands on the edge of renewal, preparing to welcome a new generation into rooms once built for spectacle and ego. Its story has not ended. It has merely paused, collecting layers of meaning along the way. What began as a restless son's attempt to prove his worth became a palace of excess, a crime scene, a hospital, a ruin, and now, a reborn landmark. In the end, Buddy Candler achieved what he most wanted. He was remembered. Not through corporate balance sheets or political titles, but through a place so saturated with human longing and contradiction that it refused to disappear. The elephants are gone. The magic shows are silent. Yet the mansion remains, standing among Georgia trees, holding its secrets close, reminding anyone who listens that ambition can build wonders, but only time decides what truly endures.